Yesterday, President Biden traveled to Pittsburgh to lay out what I thought was a very visionary plan as to how to address the crumbling infrastructure that confronts the nation. Part of the president's plan yesterday included the acknowledgement that it's not just about the roads that get us to work, but it's the child care that keeps us at work as well. And I think that the plan that he laid out yesterday in terms of concept was critical. If there's one thing we can all agree upon, it's the crumbling nature, again, of the nation's infrastructure, and the investments that he proposed yesterday are long overdue. I think that the American Jobs Plan will now move to the hearing stages in Congress. We will attempt to formulate a policy not just on the plan, but how we pay for the plan. And we acknowledge that the pandemic is far from over. And while the federal government has done, I think, a really fine job of underpinning the result of the pandemic, we all know that there's a considerable ways to go as we move from stability to stimulus. So let me outline, if I can, for just a couple of seconds, some of the president's proposals, and then I will comment on them and leave plenty of room for some questioning. So the president proposed yesterday to spur electric vehicle market opportunities. Months ago, I instructed the tax staff of the Ways and Means Committee to lay out a plan how we might better incentivize battery power storage, which I think is an essential part of what we want to do with electric vehicles. He proposed to modernize 20,000 miles of highways, roads, and main streets. He proposed repairing the worst 10,000 small bridges in the country, replacing thousands of buses and rail cars, which would be very helpful to the economy here in Western Massachusetts, given the story and success we've had. $80 billion to invest in Amtrak's repair backlog, which is a huge opportunity for those of us on the Northeast Corridor and those of us who have plans to improve passenger service between Boston, Worcester, Springfield, and Pittsfield. $111 billion for safe drinking water. It's hard to believe that in America there are parts of the country that does not have safe drinking water. $100 billion for broadband expansion. I talked to Governor Baker about that recently. He was all in. And as part of that, I'm going to do a historic comparison here because I think it's worthwhile. Expanding broadband to the 30% of the American family that doesn't have it, that's akin to what FDR proposed with rural electrification. That's how important that is to living and learning patterns across the country. It's also, as you know my fondness for American history, it's also the one issue that launched Lyndon Johnson's career as a member of Congress by providing rural electrification to the hill towns of West Texas. It prioritizes broadband infrastructure in underserved communities, and we know that particularly in red states, that's a huge issue. There's $213 billion to preserve and retrofit more than 2 million affordable and sustainable homes and houses for us to live in. $5 billion for improvement and remediation and redevelopment of brownfield and Superfund sites. I have spoken of that specifically to some of our mayors. Let me explain how that would work, and that's a proposal that I raised with the president in the White House. There are a lot of old industrial sites pronounced across New England and the Northeast that are underutilized because of what's in the ground. The legacy costs from what's in the ground, we used to call it polluter pays. The problem is 5 or 6 decades after, trying to find who's responsible seems to be a fool's errand. So instead, the federal government would partner with state and local governments to bring those properties back for commercial or housing purposes, and I think that's another wise investment. Eventually, $100 billion that will be used for workforce development Our community college system here in Massachusetts is perfectly poised for that opportunity. $18 billion for modernization of our Veterans Affairs, hospitals and clinics. I don't have to remind all of you as to what happened just up the street in Holyoke. We have 1.5 million new veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and we still have a lot of veterans from the Korean War, some from World War II, and hundreds of thousands from Vietnam. There is $400 billion for, again, affordable home or community-based care for aging relatives and people with disabilities. And for those of us, again, here in Western Massachusetts, given the great research university we have just up the street at the University of Massachusetts, $180 billion for investment in R&D. The Ways and Means Committee stands ready to contribute provisions that are grounded in forward thinking, ensure that we are prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. These contributions will touch on every corner of this country, and I'm especially proud of how this will, if done correctly, can impact Western and Central Massachusetts. While it's important to note that this is just the start of the legislative process, I know we can get this done. We fully expect our colleagues to meet us at the table and get this groundbreaking legislation signed into law. Speaker Pelosi has provided a very ambitious schedule. She'd like the plan voted on and passed in the House by July 4th. I think that as we recover from COVID, this is a perfect launching pad to get us back to the normal times that Americans and the rest of the world have enjoyed. I think it presents the finest opportunity that we've had in my lifetime. I've spoken with Governor Baker about it. I worked very hard to have 3 members of the Massachusetts congressional delegation put on the infrastructure committee because I saw this coming, not just for East West, but for Massachusetts. Think of it. I know reporters don't do process anymore. Reporters used to do process. 3 members of the Massachusetts delegation are on the infrastructure committee. In addition, our state has had a pretty good plan in place for a long period of time for upgrades that are needed, particularly in some of the rural communities as it relates to highway access. And I think that that increases not only greater efficiencies, but increases productivity, which then subsequently increases quality of life. So those are the kinds of things that are on my mind. That's what the question is, how will this be paid for? That's what the legislative process is for. The president did lay out a plan as to how he would propose that it be paid for. And now as it moves to the Congress, and within the Congress it will move to the Ways and Means Committee. We will have the initial take on how to do this. So I'm open to suggestions. And you should know, in terms of bipartisanship, I am very interested in getting Republican help. I'm going to try pretty hard. I also would say that this is something we used to all agree on, infrastructure. I was reading E.J. Dion's column yesterday, and he reminded us of what happened in 1987. And I think 70 Republicans voted to override President Reagan's veto of the transportation bill, along with just about every Democrat. And why is that important? Because that's how Lyman Street, Art Street, and all these other streets in the North Blocks were all redone. I was mayor at the time. I remember how that was done. And I think that I've watched Republican chairmen of the Transportation Committee, and I participated with them in standing up to presidents and leaders of their own party. And as it relates to infrastructure, I have stood up to leaders of my own party to make sure the legislation years ago was passed. So I think that that's the way we want to see it. In short, the president's proposal will come to us. We'll hold hearings on it. We'll take expert testimony. If I can just say this, which I think is a kind of an interesting take. Yesterday, some of the groups that said they opposed the president's plan for funding, they acknowledged simultaneously the need. I thought that was really fascinating. Yes, this has to be done, let somebody else pay for it. So that's going to be part of the challenge we're going to have going forward. I think that Congress will offer some suggestions. We will accept some of what he is proposing, but I also think timing here is a critical issue. So let's hear from these expert witnesses in the next month, month and a half. Then we will begin to write the legislation. I think that the governor is coming around. I've been pretty careful in the conversations to say we need improved service from Boston to Worcester to Springfield to Pittsfield. So this presents that opportunity. And you know, rail does pretty well from Boston to Worcester. Look what's happened here on north-south. It turned out before the pandemic to be even better than we'd anticipated it would be. And I would try to emulate that in terms of east-west. I had those conversations with, I asked the delegation about 2 weeks ago to do a call with Fred Salvucci. You would remember him, he was the principal architect of the Big Dig, and Jim Aloisi, who was a former Secretary of Transportation in the Dukakis administration. And I put them on the call so that they could talk to the Massachusetts delegation about how these things actually work. But remember that when funding comes through transportation, it comes to the state. So governors and the state transportation secretary will have some say. I am a supporter of earmarking to make sure that there's regional equity. So this is not just Boston-centric. And my plan is to make sure that we have a regional opportunity for investment. I listened to Alan Chartock this morning, and he spoke of bridges in places like Great Barrington that are blocked, that you can't use them. And I think that this is what we want to fundamentally address, including our water systems. These have been transformative events, big thinking. And I'm looking at here kind of an Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, Rayburn federal highway proposal to make this all happen. Well, the president laid out the first phase yesterday. In 2 weeks, he's going to lay out the next phase, which will relate to what he called the caring economy. And I think we have to acknowledge that in the caring economy, that as I noted earlier, it's not just about the road that takes us to work, it's the child care that allows somebody to go to work. And I think when you look at labor participation rates, getting people into the economy, getting them in positions where they could have some influence on their own lives makes a great deal of sense. So I think child care, low-income housing tax credit, and the other part of it that I left out earlier, I talked to Janet Yellen on Tuesday night. We did a briefing. Secretary of the Treasury, the two of us talked for more than a half hour. I raised issues with her, she raised a series of issues with me, but we spoke about my insistence that there be Build America bonds in this package, expansion of new markets tax credits in the package, the low-income housing tax credit, expansions of the historic tax credit, all of those issues, she said, will be in the president's proposal, and I intend to guard them in the committee. Well, I didn't say we disagree on the pay-fors. I said that we're going to hear what people have to say on the pay-fors before, presidents always give instructions knowing that when it gets to Congress, that if you can improve upon the proposals, they want to hear it. And that's what we're going to move into a stage now where if we can improve upon the president's proposal, we want to do that. I've got some ideas on that, by the way, that I won't be sharing with you either right now. I think it's the whole idea of stimulus. And it's the acknowledgement that America's infrastructure has fallen into a state of disrepair. And there has not been a major investment in infrastructure in a long period of time. I was interviewed at length by a Washington Post reporter last week. I don't know when the story's going to run. It's going to have a little bit of humor to it. But it's on gate 35X at National Airport. That's third world. And I called attention to that. And my point is that airports, roadways, bridges, highways, rail, sewer and water, broadband, housing, all of this, I think, makes a great deal of sense. If you remember during the meeting that we had at the White House, President Trump proposed $2 trillion of spending on infrastructure. At that time, we proposed $1.5 trillion. He said it should be a $2 trillion. And I'll just share this with you as well, because I think it's worthwhile, and that is that part of the agreement that we had with the administration was that if we were able to get the USMCA, Hemispheric Trade Agreement, completed, then we would move to infrastructure. Secretary Mnuchin apologized to me as he was leaving when I called him and said that to him. I said, you told me you would do this and you didn't. He said, I apologize, we wanted to.